Welcome to Straight Up Hangouts, the latest weekly event presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. I'm Ben Parizek from Barrel Strength and the Sprout Plugins. We have with us Brandon Kelly and Brad Bell from Pixel and Tonic and Adam McCombs from the Tetra group. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, today's topic is PHP debugging errors in PHP and Craft CMS. We're going to go through a handful of little tips and tricks on that, and then Brad is going to show us some skills using X-debug and debugging errors there. So with that in mind, if you have any questions out in the audience, feel free to post those questions to the Hangout. We'll get to those as we can. And let's get started. So to start off, I'm gonna share my screen here and just talk through a few things, a few quick little tips before we get into debugging actual errors. So before we even get to the code, what I'd like to ask is, what steps should we take before we start troubleshooting in PHP? And the first step we always say in Craft is make sure devMode, your config setting in general.php, is set to true. That helps reveal errors and information about those errors when you have them. And then next, there's a handful of things that Craft provides us information on, and if we know where that information is, it can help us get a little bit more information about what might be going on. So first up, I want to take us to the control panel, and down at the bottom of any page that we go to in the control panel, we have this little server info link which appeared recently. And if you click on that, you find this nice back room section of your Craft site. It'll give you an overview of what's installed on your server and some information about it. We can see on my local setup here that the image match extension isn't registering as properly installed. So that could give us some tips into something that might be happening if something isn't installed properly. There's a PHP info file tab here that can give you information on your PHP install. And then another handy one, if you don't have access to the files, if you're looking on a live site, is the logs tab here. This is going to be some top-level information on what's happening in Craft and what's being logged. It's a good page to quickly search for an error on if something's going wrong and seeing if it's popping up. Now, this information isn't only available here in the CP. It's available in two other places. If we have our devMode setting turned on and load our page here on the front end, we'll see two pieces of information here in our browser console. Here we have information on get cookie session server info, and then another drop-down for logs. So this is all of our log information as well. And then our profiling summary can give us some tips on how fast things are loading, what queries are being run, and stuff like that. So a lot of information here in our browser console that we can look towards as well. And then there's one more place to look for our logs, and that's in the file structure. If we want in our storage folder runtime logs, we can look at a particular log. Logs are full of a lot of information. I tend to be intimidated by it myself, and generally just search for the word error or warning or fail or whatever plugin name you might be trying to troubleshoot at the time. So generally text searching this file helps reveal what you might be looking for most quickly. All right, so I guess other tips before we even start troubleshooting: make sure you update Craft, make sure you update the plugins. Plugins have an option to disable them. So in our settings pages, we can go to our plugins and disable them, and I don't have any installed. but that might help us suppress a certain error and troubleshoot something more specifically. And if you're on a page and you know you're doing something heavy with lots of data or queries, it might be good to check your memory settings, both in PHP and in your craft setup, because memory errors don't always reveal themselves in the most obvious way. So keeping that in mind helps helps you find something now and then. All right. Any other tips, gentlemen, on things to consider before you even start getting into the code?
One thing worth mentioning is in the console on the profiling section, those queries are ordered by the slowest running queries at the top. So if you're trying to debug slow SQL performance, then that's a good way.
Great. And that's here in the profiling summary.
Right. Right.
Great. That's a nice detail. I didn't know that.
I wonder if it is worth taking a look at your log file again real quick. And you started off saying that they're kind of intimidating. Logs are actually pretty simple, and maybe it's worth, in case anyone else is feeling intimidated by them as well, might be worth just looking at it and showing what's going on in there, what the structure of those log files are, and all that kind of stuff.
All right. So I've got it open here, and I believe it starts, the oldest entry in the log is first, and the most recent is at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So we're...
and then basically, the way that those logs get cycled is once they reach a certain size, then the ye will basically kind of take everything in one log file and push it to .1, or push all the numbers down, and whatever's .5 goes away at that point. And so there's multiple requests that actually show up in a single log file. And if you search for just a lot of equal signs, you'll actually find the place where those requests, where one request ends and the next one begins.
I think it's asterisks.
Oh, I'm sorry, asterisks. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. And so each request divided by these, delineated by these asterisks, is going to start off with some basic information, server information about the request. So any post params that were in the request, and get params, any cookies, the same kind of stuff that you saw in the console under application log. So all of that same information is logged here. And once it's kind of done with all that stuff, at some point you'll see that it transitions from just giving basic application info to actually logging, here we go, logging all the different things that were logged throughout the request. And so basically in the code, anywhere that craft : log or ye : log is called, it's going to end up showing up in here. So that includes SQL queries, it includes just loading different application components and all that kind of stuff. And this is a sequential list, so you can see at the very beginning, it's starting off with the first thing that gets logged is that it's loading the cache application component from WebApp.php line 530. That was the very first thing that actually happened here. And it just kind of goes down from there. But anyways, text search is still definitely the way to go. And anytime you're looking for an error, you're going to look for it in the brackets. You type bracket error and bracket, and that'll bring you to just the actual errors that occurred, if there were any.
And it might be worth noting too that the errors will only, or some of this log information is only visible when you have devMode turned on.
Errors will always be logged. And then beyond that, anything that was logged with passing the force param equals true. But usually it's just errors that you'll see. And then if devMode's enabled, everything gets logged.
Yeah, so it's worth mentioning because we see this a lot. Obviously, when devMode's enabled, the log files fill up very quickly. Each log file is, by default, set to hold 1 meg of data before it rotates out. And so at any given time, there will be 6 log files, so you could have 6 megs worth of data. If devMode's enabled and you're burning through a lot of requests, then those are going to fill up quickly and rotate out. So if you're trying to debug an error that happened yesterday and you've got devMode enabled, then that error is going to have long been flushed out of the log files. So if you have devMode enabled, the best thing to do is reproduce it and then immediately look at the logs so you can have the actual error and stack trace still available to you.
Great. So I'm going to just search here for craft log in the code base in the app folder, just to see. We see craft is doing this in a lot of places in the code. We have craft : log, and it's passing in a message that will appear in our log, and giving that log message a level. So there's, I think, 4 types of level: trace, info, warning, and error. And if we have devMode off, are errors the only one that's display, or do we also see warnings? Okay. So we'll see warnings and errors if devMode is off, and we'll see everything if devMode is on. So if you're doing plugin development, you can use these this method in your plugins as well. So in your PHP code, you can send a message for your plugin in this way, or if you have a specific plugin, you can actually call my plugin. You can call your plugin by name. So in the case if we had Sprout Forms, it would be Sprout Forms plugin : log, and this would create a plugin-specific log file that appears alongside these other log files in our folder. So instead of craft.log, we would see a sproutforms.log, or whatever your plugin name is for those.
Yep.
Yeah, and also worth mentioning that these are great for handling errors that have been recovered from. If you have PHP fatal errors, like you mentioned earlier, you're out of memory, you hit your max execution time, then those get their own log folder, and it'll be in the same craft storage runtime logs, but they'll be in a PHP errors.log file.
We don't have any at the moment, but this is what it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those will take a different format. Those will be, PHP is the one that's actually writing that file out. All we can do is tell PHP where to save it. So
great.
So they look quite a bit different.
All right.
Then there's a question about plans on suppressing 404 errors. So yeah, that's something that's like a little awkward right now, is that 404 responses get logged as an actual like error that occurred right now, and so, but it's not really. It's kind of like a weird thing to treat that severely, considering that it's, anyone can trigger a 404 error, and it's not really an unexpected thing that's happening. So. Yeah, in Craft 3, we have moved 404 errors out. Those are, I want to say that they're now getting stored in their own like 404.log file or something like that.
Yeah.
So that way those get rotated, and you can have, they aren't filling up the log file and cycling all the actual errors out so quickly.
All right. Great. So next, we've discovered there's an error or something happening, and we're trying to figure out a little bit more information about it to troubleshoot it. So I was just gonna, one of the most common things we're working with in Craft is entries, and for various reasons, we're either submitting them from the front end through front-end entry forms, or the back end in updates, and sometimes something's going wrong in them. This isn't I guess this isn't supposed to be specific to entries. A lot of our plugins also have front-end form needs, or projects have front-end form needs. So frequently we're troubleshooting some sort of post request in a form, or ajax request, or whatnot. So I was going to show some of our standard tools in PHP debugging. A lot of people's low bar go-tos here are things like die, var_dump, and printr, where we know there's a post request or something happening. Here we have our saveEntry action in our controller. That's in our Craft app controller's entries controller. And we know submitting this form goes through this controller, and we want to get a little bit more information about what's happening with that entry model when it gets submitted. And when I hit save here, I see a dump of that information, and I can look through it and learn a little bit more about what's going on. Craft has some other ways we can do this too that make that experience a little bit nicer. Craft has a dump function that you could use that pretty much does the same thing as what we just see here, except it's going to, it's going to give us some syntax highlighting and make it a little bit easier for us to read what we're seeing. And then if we want to simplify what I have there, Craft has a dd function, which is dump and die. So it will do the same thing, but with just one line of code. So that's a handy snippet to create for yourself if you're troubleshooting. Again, we get the same results. I find frequently dumping this, sometimes dumping this can give you a little bit more information about the context you're in and what this means in that context. And it's worth also noting that there's a level that you can add here. So if you, by default, some of these models are fairly large, and again, maybe I'm intimidated a lot, folks. So the models have a lot of information, and as you start scrolling through them, you just see they go on for pages. So sometimes it's nice to reduce what's being output at the start. So if you add a 1 there, it's going to just give you kind of the top level stuff going on, and you can kind of increment down and learn a little bit more about the model without making it totally massive, and might help you home in on something that you're trying to see. And then one other, you can also use this craftdd to start using getting information from PHP as well. So here I'm using craftdd and dumping get class methods on this object. And that's going to tell me everything in this context. These are all the methods available in this context. We could try that on another variable or something too. And that might help us remember the name of something we're trying to use, or see what's available if we're less familiar with what we're working with at the time. All right. Any tips here, folks, that anybody wants to add?
That's the most intricate way of getting at the class reference docs I've ever seen.
There are also amazing class reference docs online. So, yes, these classes can all be found at craftcms.com/class-reference. That's helpful. Yeah, there's actually, I had one more. I'll share it. I saw this one. It's kind of the same tedious and intricate way of getting at your class reference docs. You can get the parent class of what you're working with, and then dump all the methods associated with the whole chain of parent classes that you're on. So I guess if I simplify that for the first round, you can see this is grabbing just a list of all the class hierarchy to the point where you are in the application, and then adding a dump of the class methods on each of those elements kind of gives you a quick reference class documentation of what you're working with and what's available. But the class reference is way more handy. All right. So we'll keep moving. The next kind of dump that I wanted to share, sometimes you're trying to figure out what's loading when, and it's not always obvious. And so one of the fun files, I should say, if you're just trying to learn how Craft works and understand what's being loaded, a great file to go just hang out with for a couple hours or a weekend is the WebApp.php file. And this is, I would guess Brandon or Brad could give a better overview of everything happening in this file, but generally this is initializing a lot of what's going on in Craft as an application, and then this has a pretty important method right below the init method called process request, which is something that's getting called on every page load, and helping us load everything and get everything working. So if there's a little snippet I have here that if we can use craftdd here and call or dump the Yi class map, and that's going to tell us what are all the classes that have been loaded at this point in the application. So let's do this on the front end request maybe. So if we right when the application initializes, the only thing that's added currently is a logger class. But if we go down farther, we'll see next the first thing Craft does is import all the built-in components. So if we do that same statement just after that, we'll see that Craft has loaded, I think, 400 or some odd different classes that handle all of the different things that Craft's helping, from our front-end template Craft variable to all of the elements, behavior, and stuff like that.
It's probably worth noting here, like, none of these classes have actually been loaded yet. This is just preparing for any auto-loading that might need to happen later on.
Yes, because this would be very heavy to load, I presume.
Right. Craft's not trying to load every single class under the sun for every single request. It's just preparing the class map of knowing when Craft/clear caches tool gets requested. Like, it now knows what file to resolve that to, if it happens.
All right, good clarification. And then if we keep going through this request, at some point we'll get to this process request, and I just wanted to kind of keep pointing out where the different things that we're familiar with working with kind of get prepared. Is down here somewhere. There's a plugins get loaded. Where? Here we are. Plugins, load plugins. So if we do this class map again here, we'll see once again that it didn't. Maybe this is only on the back end.
I don't think you have any plugins installed, right?
Oh, I don't have any plugins installed. Great. Well, there goes that demo. But line 256 of the WebApp.php, you can see all the different classes that are being prepared by plugins or available in the plugins. So as you're building plugins, sometimes that's handy to see if something's not loading and you thought it would be loading. It might be revealed if you find it or don't find it in that list. All right. So that's all I have there. Any other things worth noting here, folks? All right. So with that, then I'm going to hand things over to Brad and let you frame how you'd like to share a little bit of information on X-debug, a powerful tool that can help us, do all of this in a way cooler way.
All right. Let me try and share a screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Great. So what Ben has showed us is what I like to call dump-driven development. And it's how our forefathers used to debug applications. There is a thing called X-debug that works really good for PHP. They have a website and everything, xdebug.org. And Xdebug is a server-side extension that's installed that has its own protocol that it uses to communicate with PHP applications. So there's applications like PhpStorm that have really tight integration with it. If you don't use PhpStorm, there's other IDEs, NetBeans, and a couple others that I've never used that all integrate with Xdebug. There's even standalone Xdebug applications if you don't like IDEs at all. But all the ones I've tried are pretty horrible. I think Sublime Text even has an Xdebug add-on that's also pretty horrible. So what you need to do to get it running in PhpStorm is, number one, if you're using MAMP, they are kind enough to include Xdebug as an option, so make sure you've got it checked. And they include the module and everything for you. If you're not using MAMP, if you're on, you're running Homebrew or Vagrant or what have you, Homestead, you can go to Xdebug's website. They have a whole bunch of prepackaged Windows binaries. I'm assuming most people aren't.
Homestead has it built in.
Oh, Homestead. Oh, perfect. Okay. So
it's built in and it's configured perfectly. So.
Oh, nice. All right. If for whatever reason, like you need to, whatever development environment you're using does not have it built in, they have a pretty nifty tool here, so that basically if you run php-i, that's the equivalent of calling PHP info and loading it in a browser. So php.i, and then copy the output of that. It's a lot of output. And then copy, paste it into their box. I didn't need that. Analyze my PHP info. It will analyze everything in your PHP info, give you the exact file you need to download, tell you how to compile it, tells you where to put it in your PHP INI, and it's kind of just like step-by-step instructions for you here, which is kind of nice. So anyway, since MAMP has it installed, it makes it easy for us. I've got a craft site set up, and what you need to do in PhpStorm is edit a configuration, and you have options of debugging just a regular PHP script, a PHP web application, which is what we want to do. So add new web application. We're going to call it craft.dev because that's what we set our host name to in MAMP. We need to give it a server. So we create a new server, call it craft.dev. It's already set to use X-debug. If you're developing with symlinks or you're using Homestead Vagrant, then you need to set up some path mappings. And what you do is just point your source, say Homestead, you would point your source files to the location on your Homestead box. And so that just lets X-debug know that it needs to go across a symlink and know where to look to find the files. We're not doing that here, so take that off, save it. Okay, now if we try to debug with the debug button. Oh, well, I thought we'd get an error, but maybe not. Hold on. You also, if you're setting this up the first time, you'll also need to go to PhpStorm preferences, languages and frameworks, PHP. You need to select your interpreter, which is basically you're just telling PhpStorm where PHP is. So 5442 for me, you can look and see that that's pointing at my 5442 map folder. So save, apply, OK. So now when we start debugging, you can see it kicked off the browser, added a debug query string to the end, and you can see that I've got, I immediately hit a breakpoint. So I have some default breakpoints that I always have set, and what it's done is it's halted the program's execution wherever it finds this breakpoint. So a real handy one to have set is one in our error handler, which is in craft app etc errors error handler. There's a handle exception and a handle error methods, and both of these will get triggered whenever there's an exception or like a PHP warning or notice that got fired. Since the program flow is halted here, you can see that like we have every global PHP super variable available to us, and you can drill down. So like if we wanted to see server, HTTP host, is set to craft.dev, connection, keep alive, drill down into argvs, and you can see the query string. This, which is what Ben, was dumping earlier to kind of get information about kind of where you are, like the current context of the class. You can just expand that out and see all of its private properties and public. And in this case, we're interested in an exception. So you can see that an exception was thrown. It was a 503. You can see the entire stack backtrace of the exception that led us up to this point. If we just continue with the program execution here, then all of that information will be gathered and rendered and displayed on a template on the front end. So you can see, yeah, we're offline. So it was a 503 exception because the site's offline. So one thing to show is, let's say, let me close that, make sure admin log into the site. And let me just turn the system back on real quick. Okay, so let's go to an entry and save an entry. Welcome craft. And so what I'll do is I'll set a breakpoint in entries controller, entry controller. Entries.
It's plural.
Yeah, there it is. All right, entries controller. Okay, so we've already got a breakpoint in action save entry. So I will kick off a debugging session again. And save this entry. You can see we hit the breakpoint and save entry. Now we've got some buttons here, step over versus step into. And so if you want to step over something, let's say step over require post request, then it's going to execute everything inside the method, and then control program flow execution will stop at the next line. If you step into it, let's say, okay, we want to see what's actually going on in require post request, then you can do step into, and it immediately jumps into base controller require post request. You can keep on stepping into it over and over again if you want. But here we'll just step over, craft.request type. So it passes that condition. Here we'll step into get entry model, and we can see where we're populating everything that's coming from post. So craft.request.getPost entry ID, you can see in the global post variable down here, you can see entry ID is indeed in post. So it's going to grab it and then assign the value 2 to entry ID. And here just created a new variable for us to watch. So as you're stepping through, you can see values change in your variables window here, which is super handy for debugging. You can even change these values on the fly if you want. So let's say we're trying to debug something, like is an error going to happen if I change this to an entry ID that doesn't exist? So we can change that to 3 and then keep on stepping through the code and then watch as things blow up all over the place. And you can, in newer versions of PhpStorm, they actually start displaying this information in a little, actually in line with the program execution as you're stepping through it now. So if I step over locale ID, it's going to pop that up here as well as down here. So you can continue to, step over, step into, return entry. Okay, this can kind of get tedious. Like, what if we want to get way down here, 200 lines down? Let's just set another breakpoint, and you can resume program, and it'll just keep on going until it hits the next breakpoint, which will be our populate entry model. So now we've got like a current user variable defined, user session service, all this new information just from where the program's executed so far. On the left-hand side here, you've got a frames window, which is showing the entire backtrace that it took to get to the point in the code where you're at now. So like if you go to the very bottom, you can see that this entire craft app request started in index.php when we required once and then had to path to crap apt index. And so you can step through individual frames in the backtrace and see what's going on. And then all along the way, it gives you the variables for that step in the backtrace at that point in time. So this is kind of super handy, kind of like Ben was showing how to kind of get the class hierarchy up to a point. This is kind of like the program flow hierarchy to get where you were. And another nifty thing is you have a watches window here. So if you wanted to watch a variable that maybe was immediately defined here, let's say it was let's see, current user. If we dig into attributes, this username is Brad. Let's say I just wanted to keep an eye on that one particular attribute of current user. So you could do current user username. And so it's going to always keep this up here in the window, no matter like where you are in program execution. So yeah, so we've jumped out of context of current user now, so it'll say, oh, this is, you know, can't evaluate it because current user is no longer defined.
So Brad, does the frame window on the left, does that let you kind of jump back in the request to see what existed at that point in time?
Exactly, yeah.
So you can kind of go forward over breakpoints, or you can go back through the history of what it's recorded.
Yeah, it's super handy. So like internally, PHP has this get back trace method, which is, you know, it's kind of expensive to call, but that's what X-debug is using here to calculate like how it got to the point that it was in, and that's what error handler uses to display the stack trace, like when an exception is thrown when devMode's enabled. So inevitably you'll be debugging, and you'll come across, like, you know, you're trying to track down a bug that only happens, let's say, when you're iterating over like an array, and it only happens on like the 30,000th element in the array or something like that, you know. So we can do a little test here. Let's see. Let's do it in process request. So if you had a loop like for I equals 0, I less than 50,000, plus. Okay, so there's no way you would want to, like, okay, you need to test element number 30,000 for this bug, and let's just set a breakpoint right here. Okay, we hit it. So there's no way you're going to want to sit here and like step over this, you know, 30,000 times just to get to the one object that's at element number 30,000 just so you can test it, right? That's kind of a pain. So what you can do is set conditional breakpoints. So if you right-click on a breakpoint, you can see there's this condition thing, and you can say, okay, I only want to break when I equals 30,000. Okay, so at this point, we could just press the play button. And so now you can see I is equal to 30,000, and it's stopped the program for us, so we can step into it and inspect what's going on, you know, to try and recreate whatever bug. So that's kind of a handy trick. What else is there? If you want to view every single breakpoint in your application, you click this button. You can see I've got way too many here. But it's kind of a nice way to kind of mass enable and disable breakpoints. There's other options for breakpoints: log message to console. You can log evaluated expressions at breakpoint. You can remove them once they've been hit once. I honestly never used any of these, but
So Brad, in your case, you're working with a primary craft install, and you have your app folder set up in PhpStorm where all these breakpoints are kind of part of your setup. How would you approach, say, somebody who works at a firm and every website they work on is a different website with a different craft app folder? Are they able to have a base app folder in the product that has all of their favorite breakpoints set up for them?
I don't think you can export breakpoints. Honestly, like I could take all of these out now. The only ones that I really care about are the ones in the error handler, just because it's handy. Like even if I'm debugging something else, I want to know when like an exception has been thrown that I wasn't expecting, and so error handler will always stop for me, so I'll always be able to go, oh, what just happened? You know, I need to figure out what just threw that exception I wasn't expecting. But that's just more of like a personal preference thing for me. Like, you know, I could just, if I was in an agency and like doing multiple installs or whatever, I'd probably just start with no breakpoints and just set them where I'm trying to debug, like based on whatever problem I'm trying to solve.
Sounds good.
But yeah, I think that's about it. Like, it's not that complicated to set up. I feel like I might have breezed over the setup, but it's kind of
You make it look so easy, Brad. Can you revisit? I think it might have been looking at something else when you mentioned kicking off a debugging session or starting and stopping a debugging session. Can you revisit how you get this set up together? How do you determine when the page load is actually being processed by this, and how do you stop it when you don't want to be using all the overhead of the debugging and just want to be working on the site again?
Sure. Okay, so in PhpStorm, when you want to start a debugging session, once you've got your web app configured, and once you've got your server set, and then you've got your PHP and interpreter set here, then all you have to do is click the debugging button. And if you don't have any breakpoints, you know, it'll kick off a new browser session. If you don't have any breakpoints, like I just did there, it won't stop. If you've got a breakpoint and you reload the page, you know, you'll hit that. From here, you can either, you know, play and let the request resume program and let the request finish, or you can stop it and it'll just kill the entire process right here. So stop. It's done. You know, the page is white because the request was terminated, you know, out from underneath it. I mean, does that cover what you were asking?
Yeah. And then if you wanted to resume editing HTML and CSS or whatever you're doing, you refresh your page and the query string doesn't matter that it has debug in it. You just keep working.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not even 100% sure that query string is necessary for...
I think it's only necessary on the very first request.
Yeah, maybe. I guess it is necessary because totally didn't pick it up. Yeah, but there's other more complicated ways you can set up X-debug. Like you can set it up for remote debugging, where you're actually like X-debugging a server on another network, you know, but you have to open up ports in the firewall, and there's like extra configuration settings you have to do on the client and all that stuff. That's probably more complicated than what we should go through here.
Mm-hmm. So in the case of, so several people build plugins, and I think one of the things we run into with bug requests on plugins is somebody has an issue specific to PHP 5.3 or 4 or 7. Mm-hmm. In your settings, you've been setting the PHP version to a specific version in PhpStorm. Now, if you get a bug that's specific to PHP 7, do you go in there and update that to PHP 7, or is that sufficient what you have in place there?
Yeah, no, you have to. So, like in MAMP specifically, you know, you can swap your PHP versions, and one of them is 7. And each of these have their own php.ini file. And so, oh, actually, this is a good point. So the X-debug extension has to be enabled excuse me, at the php.ini level. So like for 5.4.42, if I go to edit that particular template, go all the way to the bottom, we have our X-debug session, and MAMP automatically adds the module. I should mention that, that this does need to be added as well. So if you go to PhpStorm's website, PhpStorm, configuring X-debug, they give you the things you need to add to your php.ini file in order to get all this set up too. So, and they're doing it for Zend optimizer, and because there's multiple debugging protocols, I guess. But so for X-debug, and you need to remote enable true, remote port, all that stuff. So yeah, that does need to be added to MAP. So if you were to swap to PHP 7, then they would have a separate ini file, and you need to go through and add this to PHP 7s as well. One thing we do, since we've got Adam here, Adam has graciously volunteered to let us debug a support ticket he sent in. I don't know if it was gracious.
You want to let Adam introduce it?
Oh yeah. All right, go for it, Adam.
So this bug kind of centers around a plugin I built and that I sell on Craft Plus called 404 Finder, and it's a pretty simple plugin. It's simply just there's a variable you install on your 404 pages, and as 404 errors pop up, it actually just increments those and stores those. And so in the plugin, when you go over to the plugin index page, it actually just lists them out and kind of dumps them all out. One of the things that I'm working on, though, is all of those records are being stored in the 4Finder individual table. And this is one of my first efforts working with the element record for sorting and pagination and stuff like that. So one of the roadblocks I ran into is that table is great until you've got a couple thousand 404 errors that you can't paginate through, and you can't access or sort them very easily without writing your own pagination and stuff like that. So one of the things I wanted to do was convert that to using my own tables and my own data, dump that into the element record so I can use sorting and all of that. But one of the issues I kind of ran into, I've got the 404 errors recording as an element record now. They're set up as an element record. That all seems to be working pretty great. But one of the problems I'm running into is the output. One of the columns is actually named slug. You can see on the screenshot right there, it doesn't display as part of the element record. So I kind of have been pulling my hair out in terms of why that's not showing up. Everything looks correct in terms of what queries are being called and whatnot. And so I was kind of wondering if there was a conflict with using the slug term versus, Craft has its slug reference as well too. So kind of reached a roadblock and reached out to Brandon and Brad about what might possibly be going wrong with this element record. So.
All right, so we've downloaded the 4Finder plugin, put it in our plugins folder, which I have acquired a nice collection of from debugging, and we'll go to our Craft install. Enable the plugin. 404 Finder install. Check out 404 Finder. Then immediately see we get two unknown errors occurred flash messages up at the top. So you can do a couple things here. Those messages will always be logged in Craft Storage runtime logs. So an easy way to narrow it down is to make sure devMode's enabled, reload the page, and then open up a log file, and then do the old search for bracket error. You can immediately see what's going on, or you can see the error. Integrity constraint violation, 1052 column slug and order clause is ambiguous. The SQL executed was, and it gives the whole SQL query. So select whatever from elements, join elements 19 in, and then join craft 4 finder, and you can tell that without even looking at his code, you can tell his element is using the modify elements query to join in his own tables. And then at the very end, you've got the order by slug, and this is what it's complaining about, because craft has a slug column in, I think, the elements I18N table, and the 4Finder element also probably has an element attribute called slug as well. So the SQL's confused about which one to use. Let's say this didn't get logged, and you wanted to reproduce, so or you wanted to kind of throw X-debug at it to see what's going on. So make sure we've got our breakpoint and error handler, which we do. Handle exception, I should catch it. Handle error. Actually, let me. So, oh, it's because I took the query string off. That's why. So let's just start a new debug session, and then we'll go back and reload this page. Okay. And so we just hit our exception breakpoint, and then, you know, if for whatever reason we didn't have access to the logs or it didn't get logged, whatever, you can see here the actual exception. Click on View, it opens it up in a nice kind of modal window, so you can see the whole 9 yards of what's going on. So at this point, like, you'd probably think, okay, well, I need to go to it's probably called 4Finder element type, I'm guessing. PhpStorm going really slow today.
Yeah, that's it. It's the third one down.
All right, there it is. And so, yeah, so define criteria attributes. Got a slug going on. And so you're converting, I guess, like a non-element type to an element type, right?
Correct. Yeah, it was its own table and records, and now
right.
I've linked it over the element type right now.
Yeah. So probably just what needs to happen is that I mean, there's no reason for your element type to maintain its own slug when craft already has a slug attribute for element types that it keeps track of. I mean, I'm assuming you're not doing anything different with this one than what craft would do, right?
No, yeah, the alternative idea was to change that slug to URL or something like that, URI, something like that.
Yeah, well, what you probably want to do is just write a migration that takes whatever existing values you have in this slug column and then move it over to craft's slug column. So,
gotcha.
So your element type actually wouldn't need to worry about the slug at all then. So that's probably the solution to this.
Cool. We can talk about that offline.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is like just seeing how to go from you know, an unknown error occurred, like what the heck does that mean, to being able to find the be able to set the breakpoint, see the error actually happening as it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go back to like error handler, I think, you know, we jumped a couple steps here. Like it's probably worth like expanding on that exception variable when it happens and, and getting a sense of like exactly what brought us to this exception.
Yeah, when it throws, that was one of the main things for me, is like when it says up top, you know, an unknown error occurred, that's immediately prompting you to go look in the logs, correct?
Well, or you know, set this breakpoint in the error handler, and this is kind of Brad's demonstrating the proper way to do it. I mean, the logs kind of help, but more importantly, now we can expand, so the breakpoint just got hit.
Right. Expand exception.
We can take a look at the. I guess it's worth mentioning, like, Brad had showed the frames window to the left here, or the frames pane, which is really good in most cases for seeing how you got to a particular spot in the code, kind of seeing the backtrace. When an uncaught exception gets caught by the error handler, you're usually going to miss a lot of that context. Like if you take a step back, like basically like this backtrace is going to be extremely simple, as you can see. Like it's because when you actually get to the error handler, it's just the catch-all. So it's a C application is doing a try-catch over basically the entire application, and any exceptions that float all the way up and never get caught by anything will ultimately get caught by C application and finally send it off to the error handler. So in the process, you're actually losing all of the context of like how the exception happened from the frames pane. And the only way to actually find out is by taking a look at that exception variable and taking a look at its trace property. And this is going to give you a much more in-depth view of what actually happened. So like the zero properties where the exception actually got thrown, and you can kind of see, 1 is the step beyond that, and 2 is the step before that, and so on and so forth. And so you can kind of see, like, okay, at some point, whatever, as Brad's kind of showing, like the different files that were involved, and you can actually, manually go to each of those files, go to the line number it's saying, and put together your own kind of story of what happened, how it got to this point, and put a breakpoint at those places that are right before the exception actually got thrown, and kind of get an idea of what the variables were at that point and stuff like that.
Yeah. So for example, if we go to CDB command line 396. And this is just basically what gets executed for any SQL query ever. So query internal. So we'll throw a breakpoint here. So this is going to stop on every single SQL query. So if I refresh, didn't like that.
396, not 472.
No, wrong one. 396. I think it's because I lost the query string.
You're not debugging right now.
No, apparently. There. Okay. So, so for example, like this is just a front end request. You can see, as Ben pointed out earlier, like we're in WebApp process request, and we get to the point of loading the plugins, and this is the first time in the request that a database connection, database query needs to be made. So process request calls plugin service load plugins. You can see that in the next frame. Plugin service load plugins is craft installed. Okay, so the very first query that it gets executed happens here. Then query all is here. Then we can step into that. So this is actually like a good example because you inevitably end up debugging SQL queries. So CDB command query all and query internal is good to use. So you can step over. It does a lot of logging because we're in dev mode here, and then prepare. And so here's the money shot when PDO goes to execute the statements. So we'll step over. The statement's been executed. And now you can check this. And this has all sorts of great context. So you can see the actual SQL that was executed. You can see any parameters that were bound to it. In this case, nothing, because just where enabled equals 1. Yeah, you can copy this, paste it into your favorite SQL client, execute it directly. Manipulate variables to figure out why you're not getting the data back that you want directly. Yeah, so I think that's about it. And then, yeah, you've got, like, from this, you've also got access to the whole CDB command connection here. You can see my MySQL very secure password. Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes. All right. It's a lot more powerful than our ancestors' dump-driven development. We're all way too familiar with it.
Yeah. Honestly, once you start doing this, like, you'll never want to use.
Yeah, this is amazing, because it's basic. If you compare it to dump-driven developments, it's basically like you've written 1,000 dump statements throughout your code, and you don't have to maintain them at all, and you can just kind of see them when you need them and filter through them as the page request processes. So.
Right. Yeah, super handy.
So if anybody else has questions, feel free to post them. Andrew, I think we addressed your question earlier. If we didn't, could you post a follow-up on what would be helpful to be clarified? And then Brad or Brandon or whomever, I have a question about troubleshooting Ajax requests. Is it the same? Is it different? Like, how do you approach that? I think we see a lot of questions in Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange about specifically troubleshooting requests about Ajax.
Yeah. So once you've got the X-debug connection going with your debugger, whether it's PhpStorm or whatever, that will carry on through any additional requests until you've closed that connection, either by quitting your browser or by closing it from PhpStorm. So that includes Ajax requests as well. So once you've got the main page loaded, if you set a breakpoint somewhere and then fire off the Ajax request, Craft should catch it, or PhpStorm X-debug should catch it, and
right. So
let you walk through it.
Here's a good example of that. The entries index page will fire an Ajax request to element index controller and call the get elements action on there. So if you set a breakpoint in element index controller, and the method was get elements, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll just set a breakpoint here. Debug. Let's remove our one that catches all database queries. And just go to entries. And I probably mistyped something. Yep. Admin entries. Okay, so this is the Ajax request. So yeah, it just works like normal. I think you can even see in. Isn't there a request variable that gets set that we use to identify it's an Ajax request, or maybe that was something else. So HTTP request service is Ajax request right there. Oh, server HTTP X requested with. So yeah. Ajax request. So,
yeah, it's nice to see that you can debug those types of requests in the similar workflow. I think coming from the front-end perspective, those AJAX requests are something that's kind of hidden to the browser, and if you're trying to do the dump-driven development approach on it, it's a real pain in the butt because you're constantly in your browser tools trying to figure out which response to look at to see what happened.
Right. Yeah, that's a big weakness of dump-driven development, I think. I don't know. That's all I've got.
Great. I'll give a minute if anybody else has any questions. And yeah, that's been very helpful, Brad. I know many of us have talked to several people who have dropped a support ticket Brad's way, and we get back a response that says, have you thrown X-debug at it? And it's nice to have a resource we can now point to help people get that installed and set up, because it can really help improve on the knowledge you have about what you're trying to troubleshoot.
Yeah, at some point we need to write like an official help article that actually explains this with a couple of different popular IDEs. It's going to become pretty much crucial to start using PhpStorm, or I don't know if there's any other good IDEs, but when Craft 3 comes out, just because plugin development is so much easier with that. We've done a lot to make PhpStorm just that much better with X-debug, or with PhpStorm. So.
Yeah, the JetBrains docs on this for PhpStorm are pretty comprehensive, so they're definitely worth looking through.
Great. Yeah, and I'll encourage anybody watching this now or in the future, if you have other questions around this topic, send them in to us at Straight Up Craft, or let Pixel and Tonic know even if you want. I think a lot of us, we spend a lot of time talking about what works when we code, and not as much time talking about how everything doesn't work 80% of the time that we're coding, and having resources on these things that we struggle to understand and troubleshoot. I find them very helpful. So if you have any other things that we're overlooking that would be helpful resources as we're building craft websites and plugins, let us know. We could consider more specific hangouts in the future to help dig into some of these things more. All right. With that said, I'm going to say thank you, everybody. It's been a Straight Up Hangout on debugging errors in PHP. Next week we'll be discussing the entry model, asset file model, user model, and more broadly the question, what is a model? And we'll start approaching that from the perspective of front-end developer and trying to understand that in our Twig templates and get into more generally what a model is as well. So tune in next week for more, and thank you for coming out.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
Adam.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Have a great day, everyone.